The gravity chamber of Battlestation Kronos-7 had killed more warriors than most wars. This wasn't hyperbole or the kind of exaggerated tavern talk that spread through the galaxy like a particularly persistent space fungus. No. This was documented fact, recorded in multiple languages, 3 of which were specifically invented just to describe the various ways organic matter could be compressed into shapes that would make a geometrist weep. The chambers sat in the lower decks of the station, behind 17 security doors, each one plastered with warnings in 47 languages. The 48th language consisted entirely of screaming sounds, which most species found adequately descriptive. Battlestation Kronos-7 itself was what happened when the galaxy's major powers decided they needed a neutral ground for military training. A massive construct floating in contested space, it served as an academy, proving ground, and diplomatic buffer zone all rolled into one convenient package. Various species sent their finest warriors here to train, compete, and occasionally engage in the sort of posturing that prevented actual wars. The station housed training facilities for every conceivable combat scenario. Zero-gravity arenas, environmental extremes, weapons ranges that could simulate everything from primitive projectiles to quantum destabilizers. And of course, the gravity chamber. The chamber had been built by the Virexians, a species whose idea of reasonable safety margins was what other species called actively suicidal. They designed it as the ultimate test of physical endurance, a way to separate the truly elite warriors from everyone else. The concept was simple and elegant in the way that a black hole is simple and elegant. Gravity, but more of it. Much more. The kind of more that made physicists nervous and medical staff preemptively stock up on body bags, or rather, body scoops. Sometimes body sponges. The chamber could simulate gravitational forces up to 50 times standard galactic baseline, which itself was calibrated to accommodate the average of 23 major species. To put this in perspective, most sentient species evolved on worlds ranging from 0.7 to 1.3 standard gravity. The Virexians themselves, the masochistic architects of this facility, came from a 2.1 gravity world and considered themselves exceptionally robust. They designed the chamber to go well beyond what they could handle because apparently their species had never encountered a challenge they didn't immediately want to make worse. Over the past century, exactly 247 warriors had attempted the gravity chamber at settings above 10 times standard. Of those, 32 had died immediately. 79 had suffered permanent injuries requiring cybernetic reconstruction. The remainder had survived, but with the kind of trauma that made them wake up screaming about weight. Not psychological weight or the burden of responsibility, actual literal weight pressing down on them, like the universe itself had decided to take a seat. The record for highest gravity survived was held by a Corinthian named Gorvath the Immovable, who'd managed to endure 17 times standard for approximately 4 minutes before his exoskeleton cracked like an egg and his internal organs decided to become external. He'd survived, technically, though he now existed as a brain in a jar who got very upset when anyone mentioned the word up. His jar was quite nice, though. Expensive materials, good filtration system, the works. After the incident 40 cycles ago, where 3 warriors had died in a single week, all attempting to break Gorvath's record, the station command had sealed the chamber. It had become a monument more than a facility, a reminder of the limits of mortal ambition. Tour groups would press their faces, tentacles, or sensory appendages against the observation windows and whisper in awed tones about the warriors who'd fallen to hubris and excessive downward force. And then the humans arrived. Humanity's induction into the galactic community had been, depending on who you asked, either refreshingly straightforward or deeply concerning. They'd achieved faster-than-light travel through what the scientific community generously called aggressive innovation, and what everyone else called barely controlled explosions. Their first contact had involved a human vessel accidentally ramming a collective diplomatic ship, apologizing profusely, and then offering to help fix it with tools that made station engineers weep into their appendages. But they'd proven adaptable, these humans, in the way that rodents and cockroaches were adaptable. Not the comparison anyone wanted, but accurate nonetheless. They'd integrated into galactic society, set up trade agreements, joined the standard military cooperation frameworks, and started sending their personnel to places like Kronos-7 for training. Most species had regarded this with mild interest. Humans were a 1.0 standard gravity species. Nothing remarkable about their physical capabilities. Decent endurance, surprising creativity and violence, and an unsettling tendency to befriend things that wanted to eat them, but otherwise unremarkable. The human who walked into Station Command's office 14 days ago was so unremarkable that Commander Thexilor had initially mistaken her for a maintenance worker. She stood roughly 1.7 meters tall, which was on the shorter end of the galactic average. Her build was what humans called athletic, and what most warrior species called concerningly fragile. She had dark hair pulled back in a simple tail, brown eyes that seemed perpetually amused by something no one else found funny, and the kind of relaxed posture that suggested either supreme confidence or a complete lack of survival instinct. "I want to use the gravity chamber," she'd said, as casually as someone might request directions to the nearest waste reclamation facility. Commander Thexilor, a Varath with 6 arms and over 40 years of military experience, had stared at her with all 4 of his eyes. "The chamber is sealed. Permanently." "Yeah, I saw the signs. Very dramatic. Loved the screaming language. Nice touch. But it's not actually permanently sealed, is it? Just off limits, because people kept dying. That is the definition of permanently sealed. No. Permanently sealed would mean you filled it with concrete or converted it into a storage closet. This is just locked with a bunch of scary warnings. Very different things." She'd smiled in that peculiar human way that showed teeth, which most species found either threatening or confusing. Sometimes both. "The chamber operates at gravitational forces that would crush you into component molecules," Thexilor had explained with the patience of someone addressing a particularly slow child. "Your species evolved on a 1.0 standard gravity world. The chamber starts at 5 times standard and escalates from there." The human had pulled out a datapad and begun scrolling through something. "Yeah, about that. Earth isn't actually 1.0 standard. It's 1.0 Earth gravity, sure. But according to the galactic baseline calculations, Earth is actually 1.3 standard. Your guys miscalculated during first contact because they used the wrong reference frame. Something about mixing up sea level and averaged planetary surface measurements. There's a whole paper about it. Want me to send you the link?" Thexilor had felt the beginnings of what humans called a headache, which was interesting because Vorath didn't typically experience cranial pain. Even if that were true, 1.3 is still well within the fragile range. "I'd like to try anyway." "You'll die." "Maybe, but probably not. And if I do, I'll sign whatever waiver you want. Hell, I'll pre-sign my own death certificate if it makes you feel better. Come on. The thing's just sitting there, collecting dust. What's the point of having the galaxy's most dangerous training facility if nobody uses it?" The argument had continued for 2 hours, escalating through 3 additional commanding officers and eventually requiring a legal consultation. The human had been persistent in the way that water was persistent. not through force, but through an absolute refusal to be anything other than what it was. Eventually, worn down by bureaucratic exhaustion and the realization that humans were apparently capable of arguing through sheer attrition, the station command had agreed. Waivers were signed, medical staff were put on standby, and the observation deck was opened for what everyone assumed would be either a quick failure or a moderately entertaining death. The gravity chamber itself was a perfect cube, 20 meters on each side, constructed from reinforced duralloy that could withstand the gravitational stresses it generated. The interior was featureless gray, marked only by measurement strips along the walls and a single entrance that sealed with enough redundancy to make a paranoid AI feel inadequate. The observation deck wrapped around 3 sides, with screens displaying real-time gravity readings, biological telemetry, and a helpful countdown timer that nobody had ever actually needed, because participants typically lasted seconds rather than minutes. When the human stepped into the chamber wearing standard exercise clothing and nothing else, no exoskeleton, no gravity compensators, no enhancement of any kind, the observation deck had filled with spectators. Word had spread through the station with the speed that only potential catastrophe could generate. Warriors from a dozen species crowded against the windows, datapads ready to record what they assumed would be either a historic failure or an educational example of human stupidity. The chamber door sealed with a hiss of pressurized air. The gravity generators hummed to life, producing a sound like the universe clearing its throat. The readouts began climbing. 2 times standard, 3 times, 4 times. The human stood in the center of the chamber, watching the readouts with mild interest, like someone checking the weather. At 5 times standard, a pressure that would make most species seriously reconsider their life choices. She bent down and touched her toes. Then she straightened up, rolled her shoulders, and rotated her neck with an audible crack that the audio pickups transmitted to the shocked observers. "Is this it?" Her voice came through the speakers, slightly strained but fundamentally unconcerned. "Can we go higher?" The Vorexian technician operating the controls looked at Commander Thexilor with an expression that transcended language. Thexilor made a gesture that meant approximately, "This is your problem now." The technician's manipulator appendage hesitated over the controls, then slowly, like someone feeding a predator they weren't entirely sure wouldn't bite, increased the setting. 6 times standard, 7 times. At 8 times standard, the human dropped into a squat, then pushed herself back up. She repeated this motion, again and again. She was doing exercises, in 8 times standard gravity, in the chamber where warriors went to prove themselves against the limits of physical possibility. This human was doing squats like she was at a casual gym session. "Oh, this is nice," she commented, breathing harder now, but still fundamentally conversational. "Good burn, can feel it in the quads." Someone in the observation deck made a sound like a deflating balloon. Someone else dropped their datapad, which shattered on the floor, unnoticed. A Corinthian warrior, wearing the same type of exoskeleton that Gorvath had died in, slowly sat down on the floor and began questioning every life choice that had led to this moment. The human continued exercising. She performed lunges, push-ups, and something she called burpees, which looked like a seizure but was apparently intentional. At 10 times standard gravity, the pressure that marked the beginning of the definitely fatal range for most species. She paused, breathing heavily, sweat soaking through her clothing. "Okay," she gasped, hands on her knees. "Okay, this is a workout. Can we hold here for a bit? I want to see how long I can maintain this." She stayed at 10 times standard for 23 minutes, not attempting to move much, just standing, breathing, existing in a gravitational field that should have liquefied her bones and turned her organs into jelly. The medical monitors showed stress, certainly, elevated heart rate, labored breathing, but nothing that suggested immediate catastrophic failure. She was surviving through what appeared to be sheer stubbornness and whatever mad evolutionary path had produced her species. When she finally requested return to normal gravity, she walked out of the chamber under her own power, drenched in sweat and grinning like she'd just discovered the galaxy's best restaurant. The observation deck remained silent. The kind of silence that followed when reality had performed an action so unexpected that consciousness itself needed a moment to file an error report. "That was great," she announced to the room of stunned warriors and increasingly concerned medical staff. "Same time tomorrow? I think if I build up gradually, I could hit 15 times standard in a couple weeks. Maybe 20 if I'm really pushing it." A Thracian combat instructor, whose species held 12 galactic championship titles, made a sound like gargling gravel and excused himself to go contemplate his inadequacy in private. Commander Thexilor realized he'd been holding his breath for approximately 3 minutes and needed to sit down before his respiratory system staged a protest. The Virexian technician stared at the controls like they'd personally betrayed him. And the human? She grabbed a water container, drank deeply, and started chatting with a thoroughly shell-shocked medic about proper hydration strategies during high-gravity training. She came back the next day. And the day after that. By the end of the first week, she'd established a routine. She'd arrive at 0600 station time, spend 90 minutes in progressively increasing gravity, exit looking like she'd been through a natural disaster, and then hit the station's nutrition center for what she called recovery protein. The gravity chamber, legendary crucible of warriors, monument to hubris and mortality, had become her morning gym. Other warriors attempted to follow her example with the kind of predictability that made betting pools possible. A Dralthian champion lasted 4 minutes at 6 times standard before his hydraulic musculature began leaking fluid. He survived, but required 3 days of medical reconstruction and now flinched whenever anyone mentioned the word pressure. A group of Tyrillian commandos who'd undergone extensive combat enhancement and genetic modification tried a team approach at 7 times standard. They'd theorized that mutual support would help. It had not. They'd all fallen simultaneously like buildings in an earthquake, and the resulting tangle of armored bodies had required a crane to extract. The human, whom everyone had started referring to as that insane gravity worlder, with a mix of respect and existential dread, had watched these attempts with sympathy and offered suggestions that generally amounted to maybe start lower and work up gradually. This advice was universally ignored because warriors from species with proud martial traditions don't take training advice from someone they'd initially dismissed as fragile. The subsequent failures were thus both predictable and educational, mostly educating people about the limits of pride versus physics. By week 3, she was regularly training at 15 times standard gravity. She'd started bringing entertainment because apparently 3 hours of extreme gravitational stress wasn't sufficient to hold her attention. A datapad loaded with human music, something with a lot of percussion and aggressive vocals that the observation deck's audio pickups transmitted with disturbing clarity. One day she brought a book, a physical paper book, and read while doing what she called static holds in 12 times standard. The image of a human casually reading literature while being pressed down by gravitational forces that would crush most species into paste became the most widely shared image on the station's internal network. She also started decorating. First, she brought a mat, reasoning that the bare duralloy floor was murder on the joints. Then a towel, because hygiene is important. Then a small plant in a reinforced container, because apparently her quarters didn't have good light and the chamber was empty anyway. Station Command received a formal request to install a water dispenser in the chamber. The request was denied. She brought water bottles instead, lined them up along the wall, and continued her routine undeterred. The gravity chamber, designed as the ultimate test of mortal limits, was slowly transforming into what humans called a personal gym, complete with accessories and ambient personalization. The psychological impact on the station's warrior population was profound and multifaceted, mostly faceted in the direction of what is even happening anymore. In Week 4, Kelthar Ironbound arrived. Kelthar was a Vraxian, a species renowned throughout the galaxy for their physical prowess and combat achievements. He stood 3 meters tall, with a body that looked like someone had sculpted muscle groups onto muscle groups, then added armor plating for aesthetics. He'd won the Galactic Combat Trials twice, held the record for most consecutive victories in armed combat, and possessed the kind of confidence that came from never having encountered a physical challenge he couldn't overcome. He'd heard about the humans' achievements through the network and had traveled specifically to Kronos-7 to settle what he viewed as an insult to warriors everywhere. The idea that this small, fragile-looking creature could succeed where so many champions had failed offended him on a fundamental level. It violated his understanding of how the universe worked. Therefore, it must be corrected. His challenge was issued publicly in the station's main concourse, following traditional Vraxian protocols that involved a lot of chest-beating, declarative statements about honor, and what humans would recognize as flexing. The human, who'd been in line at the nutrition center trying to decide between 2 types of grain bowl, had listened politely until he finished. "So you want to compete in the gravity chamber?" she'd clarified, holding a food tray and looking entirely unbothered by the 3-meter tower of muscle and aggression looming over her. "I will demonstrate the superiority of Vraxian conditioning and expose your accomplishments as the fraud they undoubtedly are," Kelthar had announced in a voice like grinding boulders. "Cool, sure. Tomorrow morning work for you? I usually go at 06 HFY. Dawn is when warriors meet destiny." "Right, yeah, dawn. On a space station. That definitely exists. See you at 06 HFY. The next morning, the observation deck was packed beyond capacity. Warriors from every species currently stationed at Kronos-7 had arrived to witness what was being called either a historic competition or brutal educational experience, depending on one's perspective. Betting pools had formed with complicated odds and multiple payout tiers. Station Command had assigned extra security, not to prevent violence, but to manage the crowd that desperately wanted to see it. Kelthar arrived wearing traditional Vraxian combat harness, which was less about protection and more about displaying muscular topology. He performed a series of warm-up exercises that looked like they could pulverize stone, which was exactly the point. He radiated confidence the way stars radiated light, inevitable and constant. The human arrived 3 minutes late, apologizing and explaining something about the protein dispenser being temperamental. She wore her standard exercise clothes, carried her water bottles and towel, and looked like she'd just rolled out of bed, which she had because 06 HFY was early even by military station standards. "So, how do you want to do this?" she asked, setting up her mat in the chamber. "Time competition? Who can last longest at a specific gravity? Progressive increase until someone taps out. We begin at 10 times standard," Kelthar declared. "We increase by 1 every 5 minutes until one of us surrenders or fails. This will be decisive and educational." "Sure, works for me. You ready?" They entered the chamber together. The 3-meter Vraxian warrior and the 1.7-meter human who'd turned the galaxy's deadliest training facility into her personal exercise space, the door sealed. The gravity generators engaged. The readouts began climbing while thousands of beings watched with the kind of attention usually reserved for diplomatic disasters or unexpected explosions. At 5 times standard, both stood comfortably. At 7 times, Kelthar was beginning to show strain, his movements becoming more deliberate, his breathing more controlled. The human was doing stretches, rotating her arms, and commenting to nobody in particular about the importance of warming up properly. At 10 times standard, the designated starting point, Kelthar took a solid stance and glared at his opponent with all the intensity of someone who'd built a career on intimidation and physical dominance. The human sat down on her mat, crossed her legs, and checked her data pad. 5 minutes at this level, right? She confirmed. Cool. I'm going to just chill here. Let me know when we're going up. 5 minutes passed. 11 times standard. Kelthar's armor harness began to creak ominously. The human uncrossed her legs and crossed them the other way, mentioning something about hip flexibility. 12 times standard. Kelthar's breathing was labored now, each inhale a visible effort. He remained standing through pure, stubborn determination, the kind that had carried him through countless battles and competitions. The human was doing neck rolls, commenting to herself about having slept wrong and feeling stiff. You good? She asked him, noticing his condition. You're looking kind of red. Well, redder. Your species is normally that color, right? I don't want to assume. I am fine, Kelthar forced out through clenched teeth. Continue. 13 times standard. The Vraxian champion's legs began shaking, microscopic tremors that betrayed the catastrophic strain his body was experiencing. His species could lift vehicles, could fight for hours, could endure conditions that would hospitalize most beings. But they'd evolved on a 1.7 standard gravity world. 13 times was well beyond their physiological limits, and he was maintaining his position through sheer bloody-minded refusal to admit defeat. The human stood up, walked over to him, in 13 times standard gravity, just casually strolled across the chamber like she was crossing a park, and peered at his face with concern. Hey, seriously, you don't look great. Maybe we should— I will not surrender to a— Kelthar's declaration cut off as his legs finally gave out. He collapsed like a demolished building, his armor harness shattering against the floor with a sound like a vehicle accident. He lay there, conscious but utterly immobilized, every muscle in his body having simultaneously submitted its resignation. The human helped reduce the gravity gradually, explaining to the medical team that was rushing in about the importance of not dropping it too quickly to avoid shock. She knelt beside Kelthar, who was making sounds like a deflating balloon, and offered him water through a bassinet straw. You did really good, she told him encouragingly. 13 times is seriously impressive. Most people tap out way before that. You've got great determination. Maybe work up to it more gradually next time, though? That's what I did. Started at 5, added a little bit each session. Slow and steady wins the race, you know? Kelthar, whose entire worldview was currently being crushed more thoroughly than his body had been, made a sound that might have been agreement, or might have been his dignity escaping through his respiratory system. The medical team loaded him onto an anti-grav stretcher, while the human patted his shoulders sympathetically. Anyway, since we're done early, I'm going to get in my full workout. You good if I continue? Or do you need the chamber cleared? Nobody answered, because nobody could formulate words. She took the silence as agreement, reset the gravity, and proceeded to spend the next hour training at 15 times standard, while Kelthar was carried away to medical, his legendary status having encountered something it couldn't intimidate into submission. A cheerful human with good work ethic and a cardiovascular system that apparently ran on spite. The fallout from the Kelther incident, as it became known, was immediate and far-reaching. The station's warrior population entered a collective period of introspection. Multiple species initiated emergency reviews of their training protocols. Somewhere, Gorvath the immovable, brain in his fancy jar, received a notification about the new gravity records and immediately requested his network connection be disabled, claiming he didn't want to know anymore. The human continued her routine, unconcerned with having accidentally dismantled several species' martial pride. She'd progressed to 17 times standard by week 6 and was talking about attempting 20 as a long-term goal. Other humans started arriving at the station, having heard through their communications networks about the facility. They didn't match her capability. Most of them struggled past 12 times standard. But they were all far more capable than anyone had anticipated. Station Command held an emergency meeting to discuss the human situation. The gravity chamber, once sealed as too dangerous, was now booked solid for the next 3 months, mostly by humans who treated it as a community center. They'd formed a club. There were scheduled sessions, a sign-up sheet, and someone had created a leaderboard. The leaderboard was causing psychological damage to non-human observers who saw the casual way humans discussed gravitational forces that should theoretically be fatal. "We need to reclaim the chamber," one commander argued. "It's a station facility, not a private gym." "On what grounds?" another responded. "They're using it exactly as intended. We can't fault them for being better at it than we anticipated. They're doing yoga in there. Yesterday I saw one of them napping at 8 times. Standard napping." Again, not technically against regulations. The Virexians, the species who'd built the damn thing in the first place, sent a delegation to investigate. They arrived with scientific instruments, haughty attitudes, and the confidence of species who believed they understood gravitational physics better than anyone. They left 3 days later, having revised several theoretical papers, questioned their understanding of biological stress limits, and requested detailed medical data on human physiology, with the kind of politeness that suggested they'd been humbled at a molecular level. The human, meanwhile, had started offering training sessions. She charged a modest fee, explaining that knowledge should be compensated. And also she was trying to save up for a ship upgrade. Warriors who'd spent decades perfecting their combat forms found themselves taking instruction from someone they could literally throw across a room in normal gravity. The instruction focused on breathing techniques, gradual adaptation, and what she called listening to your body, but not in the quitting way, in the not dying way. Her students universally improved. Not to her level, that seemed to be a uniquely human or possibly uniquely her capability, but they could achieve gravity tolerances they'd previously thought impossible. A Thracian commander made it to 8 times standard, a personal record for his species. He celebrated by immediately passing out, but he did so with pride. A Dralthian squadron managed 7 times as a unit, which created new tactical possibilities for their combat doctrine and required rewriting several military manuals. The observation deck, once crowded with spectators expecting disaster, now hosted regular viewers who treated the sessions like entertainment. Snack vendors set up outside. A sports commentary industry emerged, with retired warriors providing analysis of technique and form like they were discussing professional athletics. Someone created a documentary series. The station's public relations department, initially horrified, eventually just accepted it and updated their promotional materials to include Home of Galactic Gravity Training as a highlight. Commander Thexilor, who'd initially denied the chamber access, found himself managing scheduling conflicts and equipment requests. The human had submitted a formal proposal for installing better ventilation, citing the smell situation as a growing concern. She'd included a detailed budget, vendor contacts, and a petition signed by 73 other users. He'd approved it while wondering what exactly his job had become. On day 97, the human achieved 20 times standard gravity. She didn't announce it as a goal or make it a public event. She simply increased her training load during a regular morning session, held it for 12 minutes, and then returned to her normal routine. The observation deck crowd went absolutely silent, then erupted into chaos that required security intervention. Messages flooded across the galactic networks. Gorvath the Immovable sent a message from his jar that consisted entirely of the crying laughing emoji repeated 47 times. Kelthar Ironbound, who'd been recovering physically while his ego underwent intensive care, requested a meeting with her. They met in one of the station's meditation gardens, a quiet space designed for contemplation and recovery. The massive Vraxian warrior approached the small human with none of his previous bravado. "I came to acknowledge your superiority," he said formally, following traditional Vraxian protocols for admitting defeat. "Oh, don't do that," she replied, looking uncomfortable. "You're a great warrior. You've won all those championships, done all that amazing stuff. I'm just someone who's good at one specific thing. It's like comparing a sprinter and a marathon runner, you know? Different specializations. You exceeded my capabilities in every measure. In gravity tolerance, sure. But I can't do even half the combat stuff you can. I watched some of your fight recordings. You're incredible. I'd last maybe 10 seconds against you in actual combat. Less if you were angry about it." This clearly wasn't the response he'd expected. "You diminish neither yourself nor me with false modesty." "It's not false modesty. It's just reality. Everyone's good at different things. I happened to grow up on a heavy gravity world, did a lot of physical training, and have genetic luck in how my body handles pressure. You're a combat genius who's won tournaments against the galaxy's best. We're both impressive in different ways. Want to grab food? I know a place that does great Vraxian cuisine, and I've been meaning to ask you about that move you did in the semifinals against the Gorvath champion. The one where you inverted your grip mid-strike? That was beautiful." Kelthar, who'd arrived prepared for various responses ranging from gloating to dismissal, found himself completely disarmed by genuine respect and enthusiasm. They went to get food. He explained combat theory. She explained training methodology. They ended up talking for 4 hours, and by the end of it, they'd formed the kind of friendship that emerged from mutual respect and shared dedication to excellence, even when that excellence manifested in completely different domains. The gravity chamber continued its transformation. What had been a monument to the limits of ambition became something else entirely. A symbol of potential, of adaptation, of the gap between reputation and reality. The galaxy had built it as a test, a way to separate the elite from everyone else. The humans had shown up and turned it into a gym, not through disrespect, but through the simple act of treating it as what it was, a tool for training. Nothing more or less sacred than that. Other species began revising their understanding of human capabilities. The 1.3 standard gravity calculation was corrected across all official databases, with footnotes acknowledging the significant implications of the error. Medical studies were initiated to understand how human physiology achieved such gravitational tolerance. Military tacticians began including human units in high-gravity combat scenarios that had previously been considered impossible. And somewhere in the galactic archives, the entry for the gravity chamber was quietly updated to include a new record holder, with a note that simply read, "Human, 20x standard, used it to work out." The human, whose name was actually on all the official documents, but whom everyone on the station still referred to as that insane gravity worlder, continued her routine. 22 times standard by month 4. She was talking about attempting 25 just to see what happens, which caused station medical staff to preemptively increase their therapy sessions. She'd started a blog about gravity training that had 3 million subscribers across 40 systems. She'd been offered endorsement deals from equipment manufacturers, which she'd declined because that feels weird. Her modest quarters had accumulated an impressive collection of gifts from grateful students and awed observers. Crystallized gravity readings in decorative frames, a ceremonial blade from Kelthar, a Varexian meditation sphere that allegedly helped with pressure adaptation, a jar of pickled something from a species she couldn't pronounce, given with sincere appreciation and no explanation. She kept them all, sent thank you messages, and continued showing up at 0600 every morning to do the thing that everyone had once believed was impossible. The observation deck had become a social hub. People came not just to watch her train, but to meet others, to discuss technique, to share in the collective experience of witnessing someone casually exceed theoretical limits while listening to aggressive human music and occasionally pausing to answer messages on her datapad. The community that formed there was diverse, interspecies, and united by the strange shared experience of having their understanding of possible thoroughly recalibrated. Station Command eventually just accepted it. Commander Thexelor updated his reports to High Command with phrases like unprecedented interspecies cooperation and revolutionary training methodologies, and tried not to think too hard about how the deadliest facility under his watch had become the most popular social venue on the station. When asked by superiors about the situation, he simply attached video footage and let them draw their own conclusions. The conclusions typically involved long periods of silence, followed by requests for more footage. The galaxy, vast and diverse, had spent millennia establishing hierarchies of capability. Certain species were the strongest, others were the fastest, the smartest, the most adaptable. Humans had been cataloged as decent generalists, nothing remarkable, the kind of species that would contribute usefully to galactic civilization without particularly standing out. This assessment was being revised, not through human aggression or expansion, but through simple demonstration of capability that had been completely unexpected. A human had walked into the galaxy's most dangerous training facility and turned it into her morning routine. She hadn't done it to prove superiority or challenge existing hierarchies. She'd done it because it was available, it suited her training needs, and she saw no reason why she shouldn't use it. The galaxy was still processing the implications of this, academically, militarily, and philosophically. But on Battlestation Kronos-7, in the lower decks behind 17 security doors with warnings in 48 languages, the gravity chamber hummed with regular use. The legendary crucible where warriors had gone to test themselves against mortality had become something both more mundane and more profound. A place where people went to get better, to push limits, to discover that the boundaries they'd accepted weren't as fixed as they'd believed. And every morning at 0600 station time, a human showed up with water bottles, a towel, and a mat, ready to spend a few hours existing in gravitational forces that shouldn't be survivable, treating it as just another day, another workout, another small step in the ongoing project of seeing what was possible when you stopped assuming certain things were impossible. The galaxy was learning, slowly, reluctantly, but learning nonetheless, and the lesson, delivered with neither malice nor triumph, was simply this. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in the universe isn't the trap itself, but the person who looks at it and sees an opportunity instead of a warning. Human nature in 3 words, as it turned out. hold my water bottle.